Mark Harman is an Irish-born, US resident academic described as the finest living Kafka translator into English. Harman studied at University College Dublin and Yale University, where he took his BA, MA, and PhD respectively. He has taught German and Irish literature at Dartmouth, Oberlin, Franklin and Marshall, and the University of Pennsylvania. He is the editor and co-translator of Robert Walser and translator of Hermann Hesse's Soul of the Age. Harshaneeyam invited him to speak about his new book, Kafka Selected Stories, Reading Kafka Over the Years and the Uniqueness of Kafka as a Writer. To buy the book, please use the link in the show notes.
Well, interestingly enough, the first thing of Kafka that I read was The Castle in the Muir's translation. And as an undergraduate in Dublin, when I was in my early 20s, and there's an image of Kafka as a writer of doom and gloom. And I never really read him that way. I think I already had some suspicion of the fact that both as a person and as a writer, he had kind of multiple selves. And at one point he even said, and here, this is a quote, "What have I in common with myself?" So he has multiple selves, and he experiments in the diaries with these selves, and they eventually turn into literary figures, and of course, which are then detached from his own personal experience and their fictional creation. But the diary is a kind of workshop in which he experiments with what is originally biographical material. So I was powerfully affected by reading The Castle, and I think largely because I identified with Kay, the main figure, protagonist. I think, at the time I over-identified with Kay, and so much so, who was given to always over-interpreting things, and I tended to do that as a young person. But then I've since come to realize that Kay is on a kind of fool's errand. He wants to penetrate into the innards of that mysterious castle. And there are lots of signals if you detach yourself from his perspective, which is difficult to do if you identify with him. But, so Kafka, you often have to reread to really get the nuances. So there were suggestions that he's really on a kind of fool's errand, and he should give up his quest for the castle and settle down with Frida, or at least focus on the here and now, and not with this grand quest that he was on. At the same time, even though I think I misinterpreted the novel at the time, reading the novel was a kind of what Kafka called an axe for the frozen sea within us. That's what he asked that a good book should do. And it had that function for me, even though I think I was misreading it. And I didn't get the humor in the book at the time. And now I see that there's quite a bit of humor in The Castle. But that came later, that perception. And then I went to the United States to study, graduate study, and I read all of Kafka's work, and I wrote a dissertation on Kafka, on the Prussian late 18th century, early 19th century writer Heinrich von Kleist, with whom Kafka was very strongly, he loved his reading Kleist's novellas in particular. So anyway, I did a dissertation on that, and that's how I became a kind of Kafka scholar. So that leads to a different kind of engagement with Kafka. And then finally I turned to translation, and that was again another kind of engagement with Kafka.
Why do you think Kafka's work is so compelling because you can see great writers and philosophers, Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Camus, Nietzsche, and Jean-Paul Sartre. They say they are influenced by his work. Why do you think it is so?
There's a range of reasons. Even though he's a self-doubter, if you look at his diaries, he's always saying the writing isn't working out. He's a failure and the work is a failure and so on and so forth. But he set very high goals for himself. And of course, that can lead to that kind of disappointment. Um, but he aimed very high, uh, he was a very demanding critic of his own work, which can often lead to a kind of writer's block, which he experienced quite a bit. He was aesthetically ambitious for his writing. He had distinct ideas of the kind of writing that he wanted to do, and at one point, in looking at the crossouts in the castle, because he basically wrote at least a third more than is in the novel, but he had such a command of what he wanted the reader to know that he would write few enough elimination of passages in his writing. He was a very intuitive writer, and he normally didn't really change much after once he put it down on paper. But in the case of the castle, he knew once he had written a paragraph whether he wanted the reader to know this or not. And if Kay was saying things that the reader should be left free to guess, he'd just cross it out. But they are also, but for us now, since Kafka is such a phenomenon, that novel is so mysterious, we can look at it and we could see how he's working on removing all too obvious connections to his own life, to his own experience. And the reason for this is that he wanted to be a universal writer. He admired Goethe, and Goethe was perhaps the first, world author, or in a very self-conscious way. He wrote the East-West Divan and works like that, reaching far beyond Europe, and Kafka absorbed some of that ambition for himself, even though he also felt a little intimidated by Goethe because he's such a monumental presence. So I think writers can admire somebody with that kind of ambition, even if he never, achieved some of his goals, even if he never finished either, any one of the three novels he wrote. But these enormous goals that he had for himself. So that's one thing. Well, I think for the general reader, there's also, and for writers too, his writing always has a visceral quality. It's an emotional quality that you don't always get in writing that is, in ways, quite experimental, quite avant-garde. That's often very cerebral. It's mind-oriented, head-oriented. Whereas in Kafka, you really get a sense that the stakes are high. These are not just games. They're games, but they're serious games at the same time. They can be funny, but there's always something very significant existentially for the characters or for the writer by implication. And I think that's what draws in general readers in a way that writers who experiment in the way that Kafka does. I mean, if you think of the stories that I have in this book, selected story, they're all different. They're all very different. He was a sui generis, a singular writer, a writer who didn't repeat himself. He was a kind of patron saint of writing in a way. I hate using the term saint, but who can offer guidance for writers who have an exalted sense of their vocation. It's not about making money. It's not about gratifying your ego. It's about something larger and deeper than.
Now we will come to the Kafka translated by Michelle Woods. There are different chapters on each of the translators. First one is about Milena Jasenska, his girlfriend, and his fiancée at one point of time, probably, and Moir's, and about you. There is a big chapter. In that, there are a couple of things which piqued my interest. I could see the way she wrote about your life, and I could see some parallels between your life and Kafka's life. You made a statement that you are impersonating Kafka in English when you are translating.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not somebody who is terribly into self-disclosure, so it's a little uncomfortable. You know, you say things in a conversation, then you sort of think when you hear somebody repeating it, you say, "What did I say that?" In the conversation with her, I must have said, because she quotes it, but she says that I said that my ears grew up in Ireland. You know, which is kind of surreal, but I think it means something because you know, your sense of literature and literacy and how things are represented in writing and the connection with the oral tradition, which is very strong in Ireland, that all plays into how I translate, I would say. How I read, how I translate, my conception of literature, the writers I like, Joyce, Beckett, people like that, but also Kafka. I've also written about Joyce and Kafka. And I think there are parallels between Kafka's situation, you know, not with Minderet, but with Kafka's situation in Prague in the early 20th century and Joyce's situation in Dublin at the early 20th century. I mean, I don't think they would have lasted long in a room together, the two of them, because they were such different characters. You know, Joyce had an overweening ego, and Kafka's was often self-doubting. You know, Joyce had very little self-doubt. But cultural things that they admired something that they were not, which is and admired and feared and were ambivalent at times. In Joyce's case about the west of Ireland and the Irish-speaking areas in Ireland, because Joyce never bothered to learn Irish, and Kafka, on the other hand, learned Yiddish and admired the life of Jews living in the Steppe and in Eastern Europe, and particularly the theater. So anyway, that's which is a long way of saying that I think there is something. The novelist John Banville has said, I don't know how seriously he meant it, but he said, "Oh yeah, well, Kafka is an Irishman." Because there are lots of parallels, because Ireland is, in a very complicated situation, between cultures, and translation is very important in Irish culture and Irish history, just as I'm sure it is in India, even though people there often don't recognize it. I mean, I was at a artist colony called Anamakerrigan, which is on the border between the north and the south, but it's actually in the south in the Republic. And so, there's this woman who was a poet, and she asked me what I was doing there, and I said, no, I was translating Kafka. And she said, we don't think much of that here, in other words, in a translation. I love the royal weed, and do you know anything about the cultural history of this country that you would say a thing like that? And then in terms of, my translation will probably last a lot longer than your poetry. I didn't say that to her. But,
How translating Kafka altered the way you perceived him and his work?
well, it certainly has. I've always been a close reader, but translation, as we all know, demands even closer reading than one normally does. So reading Kafka attentively is slow work, but translating him is even slower, because translators have to deal with every phrase, every word even. And also there's Camus. Albert, you mentioned Camus. He came up with I think he was maybe the first to notice that, as he put it, Kafka forces the reader to reread. And that's Kafka's art. You don't get it all on the first read. Just as I was saying with The Castle, it takes often multiple readings, in fact. if you become obsessed with Kafka. One thing that the experience of Kafka made me appreciate more than I had is the precision of his writing. And of course, we have to remember he was a lawyer, but he also wrote as a lawyer. He wrote these briefs as an accident insurance lawyer, very technical stuff about, how to, as you would know from engineering, precision is, of the utmost importance, and people can lose fingers if the machine isn't properly designed, and so on and so forth. So he honed his prose in that kind of technical writing. I think that is something that is very distinctive about his writing, is that, and it's very distinctive about the way he uses German, is that it is very precise. And I've talked elsewhere or written elsewhere about the little words in German that are really untranslatable, and they're called flavoring particles. And a lot of German writers would just sprinkle them as if they were, pepper or salt or something like that, pretty randomly in their prose. Whereas my theory is that Kafka was so alert to everything, every sign he put on the page, that each one of these things, he had a particular meaning for these flavoring particles. And one of the tasks of the translator of Kafka is figuring out which of the multiple meanings this might be in this case. So this is hyper precision.
Now, you translated Kafka, and you also translated contemporary writers like Günter Grass and Martin Wassler and others. How translating Kafka is different from translating contemporary writers?
One thing I would say is that, and this goes with another question that we were talking about. With contemporary writing, with contemporary fiction in particular, I wouldn't dream of adding notes the way I did in the selected stories. And you brought up this question of, should translations be self-sufficient? And I would think in terms of contemporary writing, it should be self-sufficient, because you don't want to spoil the sense. There are occasions, even with contemporary, in the case of Günter Grass, what I translated of his was actually not fiction, but a piece, which also appeared in India, by the way, in a Mumbai-based magazine called Gallery. I think it's defunct now, but it was kind of very high-end thing with photos and all kinds of. But in that case, I thought this needs a bit of context, because he was writing about a Turkish writer, Yasser Kemal, who was also a Nobel Prize winner, and Grass sensed an affinity with him, and he was also talking about immigration issues in Germany and stuff like that. So I felt the reader needed a bit of context, which I added in notes, and in an introduction to the piece. Occasionally with contemporary writing, a note may be okay. But why did I introduce notes, so many notes in the selected story? Well, for one thing, is because I was given the opportunity by Harvard University Press, who commissioned me to do this book, and they have a series, but no translations. It's all Jane Austen, Oscar Wilde, that kind of thing. Where they have marginal notes. So that's the way they used to do it. And when I originally signed the contract, it took me quite a while. The book, it was going to be like a coffee table book, where you would have, generous margins, and then the notes would be on the same, just right beside the text. But then they changed their mind, and it's a more affordable volume than that would it be. So that gave me an opportunity to do something that is rarely done in English, but is done a lot in French. I mean, there's the Pléiade editions, which have incredibly voluminous notes at the end of the classics, Molière and all the French classics, and in translation to people like Kafka. So the French translation, or one of the French translations of the Castle, the Pléiade edition, the notes at the back are longer than the actual novel. That to me is a little excessive. But I think that, it's 100 years since Kafka's death. The world that on which he drew a lot of inspiration was completely obliterated during the Holocaust and in the post-war years. Nothing remains of that world, and yet, even though he doesn't often do, it's kind of implicit in the writing, or there are undertones that are connected with the world in which he grew up and which he lived for most of his life, with occasional trips elsewhere, and a bit of time in Berlin towards the end of his life. So it's he's a modern classic, but the classic stature that he's attained as a modern classic, the people are so interested in his writing that they deserved a little more than the translation can give them. And the reason why the translation can't give them, is a bit more restricted than the original German, comes from the fact that English has a much larger vocabulary than German. And it's the language, I believe, everybody agrees, scholars agree, that it's got the largest vocabulary of any language in the world. With most languages, when you're translating into English, you have a bit of the writer in the original language has a kind of boon that you don't have access to. And the boon is that the words they use have multiple meanings, and often they play on those multiple meanings. Whereas in English, there are different words for those different things. So you just have to make a choice. And in German, he doesn't. So, the double meanings or treble meanings are floating somehow, in the text, and it's up to the reader to decide which is the more important here, or, to give a reader some of this sense of what's going on below the surface of the text, even if it breaks the magic of translation a little bit by, allowing people to peek behind the curtain. Oh, I could also have made this, I could have chosen that word too, but, that's also present in the German, but I have to make one decision, and maybe you, reader, would prefer this one down here, it's the question with magicians, how much of the craft should they reveal? And some people would say, you shouldn't reveal any because it spoils the magic. And I would agree with that in most cases, but in the case of a writer like Kafka, he's been translated many times. There's so many different German editions, or, there's several German editions. Even the critical edition, which I've praised, and it's wonderful corrective to Max Brode's editions. But there's also a facsimile edition of people who are not happy with some of the decisions made by the editors of the critical edition. And then they have Kafka's handwriting next to their edition. So there will probably never be a definitive German edition of Kafka, because of the fluid state of his writing in the notebooks. Editors can make different decisions. Other editors will come along and say, no, that's wrong. This is how I see it. And I think in the case of a classic, you can allow readers access to that sense of flux. And I've done that in notes too. You can have very seemingly straightforward Kafka stories. Like the last one in the book is called A Commentary. Okay, so the story goes, and the title, Max Brode called it Give It Up. Disregarding Kafka's clear title in the notebook, which is A Commentary, ein Kommentar. So, he's a bit high-handed, Max. He would say, oh, France wouldn't change his mind, or, or this will attract readers in a way that a commentary sounds boring or whatever. It was very early in the morning. The streets were clean and empty. I was heading to the railway station. When I compared a tower clock with my watch, I saw that it was much later than I thought. I had to rush. The fright at this discovery made me unsure of the way. I was not yet well acquainted with this city. Fortunately, there was a policeman close by. I ran over to him and asked him breathlessly for the way. He smiled and said, "So you want to learn the way from me?" "Yes," I said, "since I cannot find it myself." "Give it up. Give it up," he said, turning away in one great sweep, like those wishing to be alone with their laughter. Now, you might think, or one might think at first, well, it's a pretty simple story. The language is pretty simple. The situation is one we can all identify with. But once you start thinking about the way, so it goes from the way to the station, and then suddenly it's just the way, and the way, of course, is a central metaphor in most religions, in India, in Eastern religions in particular. Um, uh, so, and Kafka actually was interested in not so much India, but China, Chinese culture, Japanese culture. But what I wanted to say here is that the note in the note, and talking about the necessity of notes, is that well, I would say for readers who want a bit more than just reading the story, that I'm sort of re-embedding it in the stream of writing in his notebook. And in this case, it comes in the middle of he's writing a letter to a writer called Franz Werfel, who was famous at the time, poet, playwright, then later novelist, Prague Jewish, same background as Kafka. But Kafka violently disagreed with him about a play called Schweitzer, because Kafka identified with the protagonist, and he didn't like the fact that Werfel was kind of psychoanalyzing the character, and Kafka had his reservations about psychoanalysis. So he's writing this draft. He stops with this after writing this. Anyone who has no more to say in this respect than psychoanalysis should not meddle in this matter, because, as he says elsewhere, it means debasing, quote, debasing the sufferings of a generation, end quote. And in other words, the sufferings of his generation, and of Werfel's too, although Werfel was a bit younger. And then the final thing he says before writing the story: anyone who has no more to say in this respect than psychoanalysis should not meddle in this matter. Judaism always generates its sufferings and joys almost simultaneously with the appropriate Rashi commentary. Rashi was a medieval French Talmudic scholar. And the words Kafka uses in German is Rashi Kommentar, and then comma, and so here too. And then that leads directly, just below it, to the story, which is entitled Ein Kommentar. So, there's a direct relationship between the previous entry, and that gets lost, when it gets separated. But, for readers who want a bit more than the actual text, you can kind of re-embed it if people choose to consider that, and it offers yet another interpretation of a text that can already be interpreted in many different ways.
You said the source for your translation is the German critical edition of Kafka's works, right? And can you please elaborate on that?
Well, I've already talked about that a little bit, in the sense of the critical editions are an improvement on Max Brode's edition. Somebody has calculated in the case of the castle, that there'd be several changes on each page, going from Brode's edition to the critical edition, where Brode tended to smooth things out. I mean, I just gave you a rather flagrant example where he didn't like Kafka's title, so he puts in his own. And actually, it was an amazing change he made where you can see that he just couldn't understand and he didn't like what Kafka was suggesting because there was a school teacher at one point, and the school teacher says there is no difference between the village and the castle. Brode couldn't understand that because, like the Muirs, who borrowed a lot from him and their approach to Kafka, this was a spiritual thing, you see. So if there's no difference between the terrestrial and the spiritual, what the hell is a novel about? So he's kind of correcting Kafka, yeah, Franz, Franz would have wanted, Franz made a mistake here, So obviously that's something that has to be restored, that that's not what Kafka wrote. That's what Brode wanted him to write, but it's not actually what, because Brode was the one who, promoted a very, very religious interpretation of the castle, and then the Muirs went even farther with that, and to Bunyan and Pilgrim's Progress and so on, and that's how he was read for a long time by generations, really. So in a way, it's a bit like art historians or curators in museums and the technical people, how they tidy up, how they have to repair paintings, classic paintings. And sometimes you have to do that with classic authors who've been, their texts have not come down to us in a way that really reflect the way it was written.
Why is it important to try to create Kafka's prose style? You mentioned that in your translator notes, mimicking Kafka's prose style.
The great literature survives through form and style, as much, if not more, than through themes and content. And as I said before, Kafka is a singular writer, a sui generis one, who doesn't repeat himself. It's more accurate to say a translator has to do with Kafka, especially with the story. It's not so much recreate his prose style, but rather his prose styles, in the plural, because, each story has the style that is appropriate to, when the monkey is talking, it's kind of mock, pedantic, it's an address to an academy. He wants to impress the academician, but on the other hand, he's kind of making fun of the academician. So it's kind of ironic and mock pompous and so on. And that's unlike any of the other stories in this book. Basically, his style changes based on what he wants to achieve in any particular story. And that's why he's a great artist. He's not just, settling on one way of writing. That's his trademark. And that's why, the whole phrase Kafkaesque is a bit misleading, because it's that you always wrote the same thing, and of course he didn't. Some of his stories are not Kafkaesque at all, in the common understanding of the term.
And Kafka was a polylingual writer, and he was fluent in Czech and German, and also French he could read, and Yiddish and Hebrew.
Yeah, well, he certainly was a multilingual writer. That's quite a few languages there already. And he knew a bit of it. I think he learned a bit of Italian. And of course, this differentiates himself from his literary peers in Prague. German-speaking Jews, they tended to stick to German. And, even though the majority of the population in Bohemia was Czech-speaking, they had their old self-enclosed cultural world there with opera and theater and all the rest, and libraries and so on and so forth, university. He was somebody who transcended boundaries, even in his life, that he would go to Czech speaking events that his friends couldn't go to because they didn't speak Czech enough. He could even write Czech. I mean, he'd have to show it to somebody to correct the accents or whatever, minor things. And another thing I think it's worth mentioning on a podcast like this is that Kafka himself was very interested in translation and aware of it. He was fully aware of the compromises that are vital in creating what one could call, borrowing from Shakespeare, the rough magic of translation and of the translator's craft. His understanding of the craft emerges most clearly in passages in 2 letters to Milena Jasenska, with whom he was briefly involved romantically. And she was very different from his other girlfriends in that she wasn't Jewish. And so it really made him think more about the Christian versus the Jewish. And, it sort of feeds into some things in the novel, in The Castle. She was the first Czech translator of his work. And he knew enough Czech to really be a very discerning reader of the translation. And he really liked her translation. And in fact, he invokes the role of magic in translation when he praises her translation of the Judgment for catching a personal undertone in the text. When he said, with what he calls that magic hand, which is yours. And I suppose all of us translators somehow would love to have a magic hand like that. But it shows Kafka's appreciation, which is not necessarily very common among writers, appreciation of translation. You have somebody like Milan Kundera, no translation other than his own. He wrote a chapter in the book of essays, and in which he examines one short paragraph in The Castle, and the various French translations, and then he ends with his own. But of course, he's profited from looking at all the others, and it's easy to take a sentence and say, "Well, I can do this better." Well, the translator is responsible for the whole work, and there are certain aesthetic criteria that have nothing to do with the various meanings of that particular word. And, he isn't going for that at all. He's just, they didn't get this. But he's not looking at the whole thing because there'll be too much work. Criticisms of translation are often incredibly unfair because they just pick on a phrase that somebody likes as a reader or and then goes to the original and then says they didn't like the way they did that particular phrase. I mean, come on, that's not serious critique of a translation. And I think one of the problems is that people think that, unlike with poetry, people are very aware of style. With prose, people can just think it's just language. If it's any good, it has a style, and a lot of people, because we use language all the time, they don't see that it's literary language and that it has its own laws and dynamic and so on and so forth.
We are talking about the short stories that you translated recently, but the castle that you translated, it has a wonderful forward too. There you have given examples of how by making some subtle changes in translation, how can it sound so differently, right? You have given wonderful examples there. In fact, anybody who wants to become a better reader of prose, forget about translation, better reader of prose, I think they should read that forward.
Well, thank you.
Very, very well written. Very, very well
thank
written.
you. Well, I think that's another thing that not sufficiently appreciated is that translators should always, I would say, be given a chance to say something about the text, because they've been more involved with the text than anybody else other than the writer. And, so to get some celebrity in and, write some kind of general stuff. And you could have both, because publishers want somebody who'll draw attention to the book. So, a big name, okay, they can do their short piece, But then the translator can have it can be a short piece too, but they will bring insights that, somebody who has not done that painstaking work of trying to recreate and mimic, as you say, the style of the original, that doesn't have access to. And that's, you asked me earlier about what did I learn new, what new things did I learn about Kafka through doing the, translation is that you get a much more intimate sense of the language and the way it's written than just as a reader. Because you're recreating it. You're not just reading it. You're performing the text. Performance is an important word in any discussion of translation. It's a performance of the text. We're performers. And that's why, with performance, you don't say, hey, there was a wrong note in your performance. Like when musicians talk endlessly, on these classical radio stations about, how they're performing. But you never hear critics say, you got that note wrong. Well, that's what they do with translation. It's called the gotcha moment, like on page 326, bottom paragraph, you missed something. But, somebody doing Beethoven or Mozart, oh, you didn't get that one note, Nobody does that because you'd be laughed out of court, because people are appreciating the sound of the whole thing. So they're not going to say, well, I don't think I wouldn't, that's not how I would do that note. So I think we still have ways to go in appreciating the craft of translation. And it's great that you have this program and this podcast series, because I think it draws attention to the craft. And the more one does that, the more we get into the mainstream. And things are changing. I mean, when I started off my career, I was called into the office by the chairman of the department, and he said, look, I'm nothing against this translation stuff, but, in your own interest, I think you should lay off translation. And he was probably right, but you do, I mean, you don't just do things because it's rewarding in terms of the career. I mean, and I think that's been a problem with modern language departments. I don't know how it is in India, but that they didn't value things like translation, which actually creates a public for what you're professing, for what you're talking about in your classes. How do you expect to fill your classes if their parents, know nothing about what you're doing? Because it's often the parents have a role in steering them this way or that way, and then there's not, there's more public discussion if professors at a place are translating, and that then you can have readings, and that brings in people and young people. And recently, I was interviewed for this. I think I may have sent you the link. Article in the New York Times about Kafka's afterlife, and apparently Kafka's. And I only learned from conversations with the journalist about this phenomenon, which I then looked into a bit, with Kafka's cult following on TikTok and online, and I don't look down on that at all. I mean, anyway, people get engaged. It's fine with me. And sometimes one of the things that surprised me about the TikTok things in particular was that young people saying, Gregor Samsa, that's me. I never had a student who would be open enough to say that, kind of identifying with the anxiety, the sense of the pressure to go to work, the pressure to perform, to always be productive. And so in some ways, these, there are real problems with these new media, social media, but at times it allows for a certain breakthrough like that people are not ashamed of admitting why they're attracted to something, and be open about the emotional quality of the interaction. It's not all cerebral. He's saying, the fiction is saying something powerful to them about their own lives, and they're responding in that way.
Now, you once described Kafka's writing as an editor's nightmare, right? So, could you describe a few of the editorial challenges you faced putting together this book? Because in this new selected stories edition that has translated by you, you had dual roles as translator and editor.
Well, I touched on this a little bit before, but the editor's nightmare stems from the fact that the notebooks, are a continuous stream of writing, and that it's difficult to decide where something starts and where it ends. So this creates a dilemma. And one example in the current book is a crossbreed, the story of crossbreed, which is about a hybrid creature, which is half lamb and half cat. The dilemma is that Kafka crossed out quite a few lines as he was writing it, or maybe just right after he finished. Some of these lines are very vivid and poignant. Why shouldn't that be in the story? What do we have against them? I like that better than some of the lines that are in there. So that some editors include them, even though Kafka crossed them out. And my solution was I put them in notes, and then it's up to readers to decide. Are they going to look at the notes and see, oh, there was a passage here that he cut? And so have it both ways, I suppose. But readers can just say, well, no, this is how these were Kafka's decisions, and I'll stick with what he decided the story was to be, and that he wasn't going to disclose some of these things, touching though they are. I think it's a more humanly gripping story if you include them, but it's not what Kafka decided. So readers, I can let readers be editors themselves. They can put them back in their minds. But I didn't want to completely violate Kafka's wishes, because then I thought that'd be a bit like Max Brod just saying, "Oh, I don't like the title, a commentary. I'll call it, give it up."
We have come to the final question. You have taught, translated, and are known as preeminent Kafka scholar too. So, how do you explain this? May I use the word obsession, lifelong obsession to Kafka's work? How do these roles support each other?
Yeah, well, I would start by saying, well, I don't know about preeminent, but I have paid my scholarly dues, as it were. And the roles you mentioned are complementary. I mean, teaching can, of course, inform scholarship and vice versa. For example, I happened to put Kafka's story, The Judgment, right next to Joyce's story, The Dead, on a syllabus. And then, we had a discussion of both stories. And then afterwards, I was just thinking about that, these stories are very, very dissimilar in many ways, but there's something similar about them. And I couldn't understand, why do I think there's something similar about them? And that led me then to write, an essay for Swanee Review about Joyce and Kafka. And I think I was one of the first to really, probe that, because you wouldn't think that they'd have that much in common. But it's once you get more into the context, and then you can see echoes of, the tension between certain things culturally and historically that are paralleled. So that accounts for the parallels in the work. It's not that stylistically they are similar, but it's the context in which they're writing, and that's where the similarity. So it's a cultural, historical thing that then actually leads to, one can perceive it in the text, the comparable tension between I said the Gaelic West and the Yiddish East. And of course, I won't get into it, but of course, scholarship and translation, I won't get into it too much, but scholarship and translation can also be mutually eliminated, although one has to be careful not to allow the scholarship to overwhelm the craft. So, in a way, it's good to know and be aware of all kinds of different ways of approaching somebody like Kafka. But then when you're actually sitting down and working on the craft of translation, it has to be there at the back of your mind, but you're not there as somebody advocating a way of reading Kafka. You are there and a translator, and you're kind of medium. You're not an interpreter. You're an interpreter of the style, but you're not an interpreter. That's not your business. And I've tried to keep that openness both in the translation and in all the notes. I have not said, the psychoanalytic, interpretation is preferable to that, or whatever. In fact, I was once teaching, a class on Joyce's Story of the Dead, and a student said, I said, well, it could be looked at this way, but on the other hand, it could also be looked at that way. And a student said, well, which is it, Professor? Or don't you know? And, the translator, I wouldn't say, no, but you have to be able, somebody said the definition of a great mind is the ability to keep two contradictory, thoughts in mind. Well, as a translator, in a way, you have to do that. You're a medium. You have to allow yourself to carry the tension that's in the text between seemingly opposing points of view that are somehow coalesce or are intention in the work, and that's one of the tasks of the translator, is to not close off possible approaches and interpretation. The job of the reader. That's how Kafka himself thought. I mean, he really thought that individual readers, the job was for individual readers, and he left it that way. And if you think of his thing about the axe for the frozen sea, well, he couldn't tell what the axe for an individual reader's sea would be, frozen sea would be. Each reader has their own interpretation of Kafka. We're all approaching it from our own life situations, from what we've read or haven't read, and just endless variables. And that's why he's so rich in that respect that 100 years from now, people will still be sitting around discussing Kafka and reading him. And, some of the stories in that book, they could be written yesterday, today, or 50 years from now. They haven't aged at all. And that's why it's a privilege to translate.